everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, another week of all your latest BC political news and analysis. The legislature has just wrapped up its spring session. We got a lot to talk about there, and many other things in this week. Make sure you're subscribed on the YouTubes, or I think you can subscribe on YouTubes, on the pods with the faces and the jumpers and the hoops and all of those things. We are on every single platform you can imagine, and there's an extended version in the audio format of our podcast, so stick around for more content there. We're going to bring in our panel. You know them from each and every week, and we thank them for being here each and every week. Katy Merrifield, Vice President, Wellington Advocacy, a BC Liberal strategist. Hello, Katy.
Hello, happy to be here.
Maclean Kay, Editor-in-Chief of the Orca. Hello, Maclean.
Always a pleasure.
And Jillian Oliver, BC Green strategist extraordinaire. Hello, Jillian.
Good morning, Rob.
You're the only one with extraordinaire in your title, by the way. I added that in.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's in my contract.
It is in your contract. It is every week.
Blatant favoritism, filing a complaint.
Oh, that'll go right to the Czech ombudsperson, which is me. All right, let's start with the session. There's so many different ways we could examine the session, where there was, I think, 15 different bills, sick pay, electoral boundaries commission, that type of thing. There was lively question periods. There was the stuff outside of politics with Ferry Creek, with the continued cruise ship U.S. legislation debate. There was kind of the idea of this return to our first sort of session in COVID that kind of almost felt a little normal, not quite, but there's a lot of different ways to look at it. So we'll start with you, Maclean. What did you take away from our spring session that is now wrapped up this week?
Well, I think that there's a difference between what we'll take away today and the day after and what we'll remember 6 months from now or the years from now. I think some of the things we're going to remember, even possibly next year, is the debate on the Kamloops Residential School, Adam Olson's speech, which we had on this show. I think that's one of those things that we'll be remembering back. There's a few issues that may continue to flare up that, this session may be sort of the start of something bigger. You mentioned the cruise ships, you mentioned COVID, sick pay, that kind of thing. Those will be the things that I think that we might be talking about again at some point, perhaps in a future callback on the podcast section of the show. But other than that, I mean, it was kind of a strangely quiet session, all things considered.
Yeah, it was. I mean, maybe that's because COVID dominates everything, or maybe, I don't know. Jillian, how do you kind of view it all?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that most of the notable things were not actually related to legislation. It was a relatively thin legislative agenda. I think sick pay was probably the most notable thing, although I had forgotten about the Electoral Boundaries Commission. That will definitely have ramifications that I'm sure we'll be talking about whenever those new electoral boundaries come out. But I think the government is focused on COVID. Like you said, they've been doing a good job with their vaccine rollout. And it'll be interesting to see in the fall session if we start to see a little bit more of a robust legislative agenda, because after all, they did say that they really needed this majority government because they needed to, implement a big agenda. So we're kind of still waiting to see that, and we'll see how it goes.
Katy, the politics of this, did the session interest you politically, the kind of back and forth?
It is my opinion that no one watches legislative procedures aside from political staff, journalists, and maybe people at the dentist if the TV only has one channel. So
other than insomnia too. If you're suffering insomnia at 3 a.m, it's good to.
Very true. Yeah. Very true. But I'll just focus on what I think went poorly for the government over the last few months, not necessarily directly tied to the legislative agenda. But starting, I think the vaccine rollout is going very well now. Let's not forget the initially botched rollout in Surrey, forcing residents to wait in 6 to 8 hour lineups in random fields, only to be turned away without getting a shot. There was the lengthy standoff over Old Growth and Ferry Creek that ended with a pause instead of a real solution. For me, we have a minister of mental health and addictions with no power, no money, and basically no clue what she's doing. And kudos to Trevor Halford, the BC Liberal critic, for really holding her to account. And then can't forget Horgan blaming an entire generation for blowing it for the rest of us over growing COVID cases. And finally, the cruise ship sector being currently held hostage. So that's what I think went poorly for the government over this session. Although, as we continue to see with the latest Angus Reid polling numbers, that really hasn't done any significant political damage to the premier just yet.
No. I mean, it's interesting. If no one watches the legislature, which there's a fair argument that people don't, but I don't think you come away from a session like this spring session with any major kind of weird sniff test of John Horgan. Nothing really kind of lingers beyond a few missteps here and there and a couple issues. People are happy to be vaccinated and moving on and partying and celebrating, and that maybe that washes away all of the stuff we were talking about, the legislation and all those other things. I don't know, but I wonder what the fall session will be like, which is 4 months from now in October. Will it be different? Are we on a trajectory to kind of change our political discourse since the last election? I don't know, but it was not a session that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. That's why we're going to move right on.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.
This one, we may have different kind of more hot takes on it. I don't know as well, but it's one of the parts of the session was the budget and then the budget debates. And in the budget debates, we discovered that Premier John Horgan has increased his office budget by around $3.3 million, creating a new planning and priorities secretariat, which he says he needs to coordinate and manage his agenda across ministries with a bunch of directors, executive directors, and an assistant deputy minister. Now, it's not really a lot of money, actually, but it was used repeatedly in this session as a contrast between things like mental health spending, which is less than the Premier's office spending in terms of ministry budgets, and other things like that. So let's go around the table and talk about this. Premier's budget amounts. Does it matter? Is it useful? Is it a wedge? Can we make something out of it? Should we? Why don't we start with you, Katy?
Yeah, so to start off, I'm going to be pretty fair here. I understand the rationale. Under the BC Liberals, we ran the leanest government in the entire country, from the bureaucracy to right down to ministers' offices. Salaries were kept comparatively low, and I think all staff shouldered more responsibilities than other provincial counterparts. So I do understand the desire of government to want to staff up. And obviously, in this new direction, this is emulating the system that Alberta currently has. That said, I think the reasons that have been provided by the Premier and Finance Minister to a certain extent are pretty lame. For example, Horgan cited too much correspondence. They need more staff to handle correspondence. Well, Maclean and I will know that there's an entire branch of the Premier's office dedicated to managing that process already. And frankly, most correspondence is deferred to ministries anyway. Another point they brought up is they need 10 extra bureaucrats to manage their ambitious agenda. And to that I say, what ambitious agenda? Like, look at the last budget. How many civil servants does it take to hand out free passes for TransLink to kids, or to create 3,700 new childcare spaces? I think overall, like, the fact of the matter is, Horgan is increasing his budget because he knows he has the political capital to get away with it, period.
Mm-hmm. Jillian, what do you make of it, given that it's kind of a morphed version of the CASA, the Confidence and Supply Secretariat that existed with the Green and NDP minority government situation, that's now kind of continues to exist and has been beefed up a little bit, but doesn't involve the Greens at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting. It's the same deputy minister that was running the CASA Secretariat that's running this new office within the Premier's office, which is what Rob's referring to. I think that maybe the government kind of came to rely on it, because what the Secretariat did was sort of, really make sure that we were on track to accomplish all of the items in CASA, which was basically the minority government's agenda. I think that it makes sense. Both the opposition parties have criticized the government for sort of a lack of an overarching vision, lack of sort of like a coherent plan for the province. It makes sense that they would want to have this kind of office, especially with such a large caucus. They've added lots of parliamentary secretaries under this government. It makes sense that they would want to have that. But I think, like Katy said, we're sort of still waiting to see if they actually do implement a significant agenda and a cohesive vision. Like I said in the previous segment, I think they're still focused on COVID, and that's fair. But we'll see in the next year or so if this actually bears fruit and does what the Premier said it was going to do.
The other thing the premier mentioned is that he's based in Victoria, unlike the previous premiers, and so he needs extra support in Vancouver to manage the agenda over there. And maybe there's something to that, especially in the last year when travel has been fairly restricted and he's not traveling the province. Maclean, does any of that or any of the other kind of rationales ring true with you, or what do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, both Katy and Jillian make good points, and I think they're both right. There is a third factor at play, which is the fact that political staff of all parties and all stripes often follow their parties of choice across the country where opportunities present themselves. In other words, where there are jobs. And in the NDP's case, it's a national party that has, won provincial government, and they're the official opposition a couple more places. But in government is where these jobs are created, and so there is some pressure, I think, nationally, if you're an NDP government, to create jobs for NDP workers. And you'll see a lot of their staff, who many of whom are very talented, have come here from elsewhere, specifically to work in government. And so, yes, there is some pressure on the NDP government to create jobs.
Eh, I mean, the Liberals did this too.
Of course, as I
Yeah,
say, all parties
yeah, yeah.
across the country. The difference the NDP has is they're less likely to be in power than your average liberal or conservative moment, and they've never formed federal government. So
Mhm.
there's those jobs there are off the table for now. But provincially speaking, Victoria is it.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's a good point. There's a lot of New Democrats who've come from Alberta,
Hmm.
have come from Manitoba, have come from the federal party in Ottawa, who have landed in the BC government because it's one of the only places, as Maclean, as you mentioned, where they're working in government, enacting their agenda. So it's kind of a training ground in some ways for a new generation of New Democrats. Who will be out there working the campaigns in various other provinces and even federally if we have a snap election. So I have a hard time, part of me, I guess, I've just seen so many partisan kind of hires and machinations in premiers' offices that I have a hard time getting too worked up about this, especially when the budget is $60 billion and this is a $3 million increase. However, I think, and I'll just open this up to anyone who wants to jump in, there was a couple times when this proved a very effective kind of political battering ram into other issues on mental health, on kind of the priorities of government. They're cutting back here, for example. I think it was a fresh food program, fresh fruit and vegetables for schools at one point that the government wasn't going to fund, and the Liberals pointed out, well, you're funding your premier's office with extra money. Why can't you find $1 million here for that? Was there anyone feel free to jump in on this, anything that jumped out at you as making this an effective political issue?
Well, we've talked about it before. It's the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions, the contrast there. And
Mhm.
you're right to say that, I mean, you're not talking about a large amount of money. You're absolutely right. But it's such an easy contrast to draw with the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions when, overdose numbers are still getting worse. And we've talked about the
Mhm.
structural reasons behind that, and all the programs are in a different ministry. It's not like they don't exist. But it is a very easy parallel and contrast to draw.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, just it's less about the money. It's more about the optics. As I said, I think Horgan is cashing in on his political capital. But this is a future attack talking point. If the government declines in popularity, if they make poor decisions, then it's just a natural contrast. Like, instead of funding said initiative, which British Columbians actually rely on, you instead bloated your office for your own partisan gain. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a risk. And it's a potentially useful tool for the BC Liberals going forward.
Yep, and it's all fair in politics. I mean, that's how you craft attack ads, is that contrast between the priorities and decisions that a government makes and doesn't make. So
Yeah.
it's all fair game.
More episodes of Political Capital are available at checknews.ca/podcasts or search Political Capital wherever you listen to podcasts.
Let's move on to a topic that we are going to pick up in the podcast a little bit later, but we're going to go around the table here now on the implosion of the federal Green Party in Ottawa. We discussed last week in our hot take the defection of Green MP from Fredericton, Jenica Atwin, who crossed the floor to the Liberals over a number of other issues, including the leadership of the party and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The party has since sort of disintegrated a bit since then, with the leader under fire, and an attempt at one point to maybe question her leadership that didn't go anywhere, and then press conferences and dirty laundry and anonymous sources and all that sort of stuff. Jillian, what is going on, and how big of a deal is it, really, do you think?
Well, like off the top, it is a big deal, obviously. Like, I don't think the Federal Green Party has ever gotten this much attention, and none of it's good. I think that a lot of this, there was a lot of things that were bubbling under the surface in the party that kind of all came out at once, that the public is seeing this week. I think that it's sort of, it goes back to a lot of unique underlying dynamics in the party. One of them, which is sort of like a unique feature of Green parties, is the decentralization of power within the party. Um, in Green parties, one of their kind of core beliefs is this idea of grassroots democracy. So they have sort of a diffuse sense of power between federal council and MPs and the leader, leaving the leader with less power than they would have in another party, and less of sort of like an ability to make top-down decision making. And so I think, depending on who you get in all of those positions, if they can't figure out how to work together, you get a lot of infighting, which is what we're seeing bubbling to the surface. We saw in April, there was some news reports that didn't kind of make as big of a splash as the events of the last week, that Annamie Paul has faced undermining from the federal council, which is sort of like the elected board of directors of a political party. There was allegations that they had treated her in a way that was racist, that they didn't let her advance her agenda and make the necessary changes she thought she needed to make to be an effective leader and to get ready for the election. And then as soon as the news broke about Jenica Atwin, we kind of just saw everything explode. So I think that, while Annamie Paul entered into a situation that was very challenging and difficult, she also didn't do herself a lot of favors in the last week. She obviously dropped the ball when it comes to caucus management. And I think she had a lot of opportunities this week to sort of turn things around a little bit and sort of pivot to talking about her agenda, because the spotlight was on her, and she didn't do that. So I think they're quickly losing opportunities to turn things around.
And it's worth pointing out, Annamie Paul is the first black female leader of Jewish faith of any Canadian party, and that has been brought up as part of this discussion because, as you mentioned, there were allegations of racism and kind of stereotypical tropes that were used to define her in some ways by people, and she pushed back very hard against that in her response to this. It became part of the public discourse as well. Katy, what do we make of all of this?
Well, I definitely consider Jillian the subject matter expert on this one. For me, this entire affair just smacked of sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism. As you mentioned, Annamie Paul's first Black Jewish woman elected to lead a federal party, and I think the way that she is being treated by her party is abhorrent. I thought her message in the presser a couple days ago was on point when she said that collaboration and collegiality does not mean bowing down or being brought to heel. And I think that if she can survive the July 20th confidence vote, I think Ms. Paul really has the opportunity to become a true force in federal politics, whether she has a seat or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maclean, does the future of the Greens brighten if she survives her confidence vote, or does the loss of a third of their caucus, one of 3 MPs, kind of dampen their fortunes?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. She was voted leader of the party. What was it, 6 months ago? 6 months.
8, I think.
8 months. Well, less than a year. How many elections was Elizabeth May at the helm? And it's not a criticism of Elizabeth May. She built that party from the ground up. She's the first MP. She deserves a lot of credit. But the last federal election was held against the backdrop against, the era of Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion protests and mass movements. And Elizabeth May got 5% of the vote nationally. That's if the Green Party can't capitalize on that moment in time, then it's time to try something else. And they did, to their credit. They're trying Annamie Paul, who I've actually been fairly impressed with. And for them to not even give her an election to try and prove herself and to see if, the voters of the Green Party, if that enthusiasm can't be replicated with, swing voters and undecided voters, with an election coming up in just months, I mean, it's just, I don't understand what's happening there. As I say, I think we're best to defer to Jillian as the subject matter effort. But from the outside, man, does it ever look ugly.
And we'll come back to it in the podcast. But it is another example of the smaller the stakes, the more vicious the politics. Yeah. Because who cares what the Green position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is? And to spike the party into the ground like this on the eve of an election on that issue is bewildering to me, but we'll come back to it. Lots to talk about there. We're going to quickly do our hot take of the week. lots of COVID lotteries going on in provinces and other states, including in Alberta, announcing up to 3 prizes of $1 million in cash if you get vaccinated and 40 travel-related prizes. Why are we not doing a COVID lottery or reward system in British Columbia? Let's go around the table. Maclean, how come?
Well, because there's no perceived need to do it here, and that may change. There's a lot of people making fun of this, I think, because it's happening in Alberta under a conservative government. But we need everyone to get their shots, and if this helps persuade some hesitant people from making themselves and me safer, I think it's a fine idea.
Yeah, Katy?
British Columbians are just too damn good at following rules. That's what it comes down to. I would love to see this here. And I can tell you, like, Horgan and Kenny are pretty close. They get along very, very well. So I want Premier Horgan to call his buddy, Premier Kenny, get the logistics and implement this here. Or just give me $1 million.
Right.
Those are your choices.
Yeah. I mean, I think I could see it as something Horgan might want to do, but so far it's been Adrian Dix who's been asked this question. He's dumped cold water all over it. Jillian, is this good, bad idea? What should we be doing there?
I think that I'm not significantly opposed to it. I think that there might be other more effective ways. It'll be interesting to see how effective it is in Alberta. And if we do, need an extra incentive for British Columbians, there's no reason we shouldn't do it. But there might be other more effective science-based ways to reduce vaccine hesitancy as well.
Sure. Yeah. Although I guess the question is there anything that would be bad by doing this? Do we hurt our vaccine uptake in any way? I don't know if I see the downside. So I'm kind of wondering why and we have a Crown Lottery Corporation. Why don't we just order BC Lottery to do a couple $1 million or give away something? We have a liquor.
I have a better idea.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Ooh.
Take the $3 million that Horgan used to inflate his budget
Oh, there we go.
and put it towards this.
Squaring the circle.
The
Well
ultimate
done.
wedge issue. There we go. Okay, you win that round, Katy. You win. Thanks for everyone for watching. Stick around for more content, and we'll see you next week on Political Capital.